Okay, I'm happy that Hazel came before me because she already said a lot of things that I was planning on saying, and so I don't have to repeat them. But as she already said, and my slide is a little bit with older data, we know that the prevalence of FGM is well documented in 27 African countries and in Yemen and Iraq, but recently also a lot of studies have shown that also in Asia there are increasing numbers of research showing that FGM is really also a problem in Asia. But actually in Europe we have no idea about what the real prevalence is of FGM, and it's kind of important because due to migration, it's becoming more and more a problem here in Europe too. So actually what we did in our situation analysis is we looked at existing information, so existing studies and data on FGM prevalence in the EU. We did a SWOT analysis, and based on that SWOT analysis, we developed a common definition and a methodology for estimating prevalence of FGM in Europe. So first of all, what we did was we looked at literature research, but next to that we also contacted different statistical offices and asked them about the different kinds of information that we could have access to. For example, can we have access to data about ethnicity, just to know what's possible and what is not. And then we did a literature review, which ended up with 13 papers that we used for our SWOT analysis. I have to say that we only included papers which said something about FGM prevalence on a national level in the EU. So if it was in Switzerland, we didn't include it. If it was about a specific region, we didn't include it. So we talked about national studies. And what we found was that actually concerning a definition of what FGM prevalence is, we could only found 3 studies who spoke of any definition, and reports from UNICEF and from EGE also showed definitions. But so it's only 3 out of the 13 of our studies which mentioned any kind of definition. If we looked at the methods that were used to estimate the prevalence, we saw that 9 out of 13 studies used an indirect estimation based on secondary sources. So what they did was they looked at different kinds of registers, like for example, population registers, birth registers, and so on. They might have used one register, but they also sometimes used different kinds of registers and combined the information. There was only one study from 2012 that used primary data, so from a study they did before, but actually there was also indirect information because they asked midwives how many women with FGM that they had encountered. So it were no direct estimations. And so what we see in those 9 studies or papers is that they used the extrapolation of FGM countries prevalence method. I'm going to say the extrapolation method, which actually means that the researchers take the number of women that they can find in the register originating from a country where FGM is known to be practiced. They look how many women and girls do we have in our country who have migrated from there, and then they multiply this by the percentage of the women who have been affected in the home country. And then they sum up all the different nationalities and they come to one prevalence number. In some of the studies, they did some corrections on these data. For example, the study of Extakate, she did a correction based on the age of girls because the DHS data looks at girls from the age of 15 until women until the age of 50, but yeah, a woman who was circumcised when she was 50 might also be circumcised the day after. So she corrected for age. And also a lot of corrections were made based on the region where women were coming from, because we know that in one country, for example in Senegal, you see that in one region there is a higher percentage of FGM practice than in other regions. And so it's important to take that into account. Then 4 documents reported on direct methods to estimate the prevalence, but actually those 4 documents were only about 2 studies, a French one and an Italian one. The Italians, they published more. And so actually what they did was they took a sample which was not a national randomized sample, because the numbers of FGM are too low in Europe to really go and do a national survey. You would have to have a lot of resources to find women if you want to randomize. So what they did was they recruited in gynecological cabinets, or they did a facility-based sampling and a snowball sampling. And then afterwards, when they had done their direct study, they also used the extrapolation method to generalize it for the entire country. Important to mention here is that the Italians speak of a selection hypothesis, and they use this to correct their data too, because they say that the characteristics of migrants might be different from the women who stayed in their country of origin. They might be more wealthy, more educated, or more urbanized, so there might be a difference. So they have a selection hypothesis. And then the French, they claim that we should look at an interval of prevalence, because we're not sure who the women are who have migrated. So they might all have undergone circumcision, they might not, none of them might have done it, but you should have an interval with a minimum and a maximum. So, looking at the 2 methods, we could see that both had strengths and weaknesses. When we look at the indirect estimation methods, we see that, well, they're much cheaper than the direct methods, they are less complex, and actually they give quite a reliable approximation of the estimated number. And if it is to just look at what the trends are and what an impact of a prevention program might be, this is a good enough method. But there are limitations. For example, you always rely on migration data, and the definitions of what a migrant is not always clear in the data that you're using. Also, the results are always behind on the real situation, because there are constant fluctuations in the prevalence numbers, but also in the migration numbers. And we also lack information on ethnicity, on the region of origin, and so on. And then another important definition problem is actually the fact that we talk about daughters in these studies, but it's not defined whether it's first or second generation. And if it is defined, it's not always clear, are we talking about first generation migrants or first generation demographically speaking? So there's a lot of confusion about. We also have to take into account that migration might have an impact, as the Italians already suggested with their selection hypothesis. Migrants might have a different profile, but also their view on FGM might have changed. FGM might have been the reason that they came to Europe, or girls might have been circumcised before fleeing to Europe because it's prohibited here. So the time that has passed between arrival and the moment that you're going to measure the prevalence might have an influence. And the fact that sometimes asylum seekers are taken into account, sometimes they're not. It might be important to do this, but this will depend on the country that you're looking at. For example, in Hungary, in the study from Hungary, we saw that there were not so many migrants at that time. It was before the crisis. So there it was important to look at the asylum seekers, but actually when you look in Belgium, for example, or in Italy, you see that the difference, there's not such a big difference in the profile of asylum seekers as people who are registered here. Okay, then concerning the direct estimations, as I said, there were only 2 studies, and the strength of a direct estimation is actually that you can control for all the limitations from the indirect methods. But you should be aware that you need to have interviewers who are very well trained, because it's a sensitive topic to talk about, especially in countries where it's forbidden. You're easily going to ask suggestive questions, so interviewers should be well trained to avoid those kind of questions, and they should be aware that they might receive social desirable answers. So an intensive training is very important. Also, some studies suggest that we should do both a survey and a clinical examination, but the studies that we've seen show that actually there's an information bias. Women don't always know that what kind of type they have had or whether they were circumcised, and doctors don't seem to be very good experts in identifying the different kind of types. So it's not very useful to use it for prevalence studies. So what are our conclusions? Well, we took concerning the common definition, we took the definition from EGE, which is the number of women and girls in FGM prevalence is the number of women and girls in that country who have undergone FGM at a certain point in time, expressed as the proportion of the total number of women living in the country but originating from countries where FGM is practiced. And then we added, and their female descendants, because we thought that was something that was still lacking, which came forward in other definitions. So we made a little bit of a combination. Then concerning the methods, we think that it should be a matter of choice, available financial means, and the objectives of the estimation. If it's to do some policy, to plan prevention, funding, the exact number is not always necessary. That means that if you are saying, well, 1,000 women are affected or 10,000 women are affected, yeah, that's going to be a big difference. But if the difference between a direct and an indirect estimation is going to be 100 women, then it's no use doing a direct estimation because it's going to cost you more. So we would say, look at what you're going to use the numbers for. And if you really want to have exact numbers for countries where we expect there to be a low prevalence, we would suggest to use an indirect method, but to apply some corrections, such as on age, wealth, and so on, and to use, as the French propose, a minimum and a maximum interval of prevalence. For countries where there is a high expected prevalence, we would propose to use our sample design, but we're still piloting it, and it's come to end yesterday, so the data has not been analyzed yet, but there are some problems with our sample design. But that's for next year. But we would suggest that you should pay a lot of focus to the careful selection of and training of the interviewers and the questionnaire you're going to use. That also it should be more something longitudinal to see whether there is a change in attitude and what this will mean for the second generation migrants. And we would also suggest expanding the age and using good definitions for descendants and generations and so on. The comparison of an indirect estimation and surveys they allow to do these corrections. So if you expect a high prevalence, then do both. That's it.